Now, moving on, we have another brilliant session for you. And when we speak to our network, we often hear about the psychological side of data challenges. So I'm thrilled that today, Tom Fletcher, VP of Data Analytics at Partner RE, is joining us to share the blessings and pitfalls of modern machine learning versus statistical modeling, among other topics. Tom is able to offer a unique perspective with his background in psychology statistics and will walk us through some of the work he's been doing at Partner RE in this area. I suspect we'll have lots of questions for this session, so do submit yours as soon as they come up, and we'll do our best to have Tom answer as many as possible. With that, I step aside once again and welcome Tom to our virtual stage.
Thank you. All right, so I am Tom Fletcher, and I think I can advance the slides here. Vice President, Data Analytics, and by training and profession, I am an organizational psychologist. I stumbled into insurance about 15 years ago, quite by accident, and I've been masquerading as a statistician or data scientist ever since. Most of my career in insurance hasn't been about getting more and more technical, although I've done that, right? As new techniques come on board or new technical challenges that need to be solved, of course, I've spent the energy learning about them. But far more of my energy has been spent going, how is it that I can be effective in my role? How is it that I can get other people to understand how models can help them? And how do I help my team build and sustain credibility? And I've done this across a number of carriers and now in the insurance world. What I'd like to start with is, where is your organization's maturity in terms of advanced analytics? I'll give you a moment to submit some questions here, or submit an answer. While it's pretty universal, there's no variance here. Over the years, when I asked questions like this, clearly the distribution has been shifting. And I left academia about 15 or 20 years ago, give or take, and went into an organization that was described as data-driven. But upon arrival, I found out that they were, in fact, more data aspiring, right? That they were on a journey. Nothing wrong with that. All organizations are on some level of journey. I would have expected to see a few companies, a few organizations that are data aspiring, looking to get into, evidence-based decision making. Very few companies have I seen that every piece of analytic product gets delivered into production, and nor should it, because there's a lot of factors that go into that, and sometimes it's just that it's just not, you weren't working on the right problem, or the right solution didn't come about from the data at hand, and on and on. What I'd like to talk about in the next 15 or 20 minutes is what are some of those things, what's a framework to think about in order to try to get your organization closer to that. We adopt most everything. And of course, some of it is luck, picking the right projects, working on the things that are most likely to be implemented, but a good bit of it isn't luck, right? It's really thinking about, we think about analytics as an input-throughput-output process, right? There's many considerations and feedback loops here. We often think about analytics as this throughput piece, right? Data munging, feature engineering, restructuring of the data, some kind of pushing and pulling of data, and then piping it through some kind of machine, whether that machine be an analyst, a statistician, some technical architecture or whatnot, but there needs to be some interpretation of it, and then we go through a wash, rinse, repeat cycle. But I would argue that what's more important are the bookends here, right? What are the inputs, right? Did you start with an adequate business problem that truly needed to be solved? Did you have the available data, the requisite data to solve that particular business problem and not trying to fit a business problem to data? And did you have proper engagement from your business partners, right? Did you have subject matter expertise to help when weird things come out of the data, some insight that the data scientist doesn't quite understand? Why is that, right? And data scientists can come back and say, there's an issue here, clearly. I may not fully understand your business, but can you help with this? And further, when I deliver something that might be useful to you, is the business engaged to say, yeah, we're on the right path, keep going. Or, no, we need to take a slight veer to the left. The other bookend is the audience, which is also your business partners, but not always. What are the metrics you're starting with? Or are we using metrics that don't necessarily make sense, that shouldn't correlate with targets? Do we even have a measure of the target that we're trying to improve or build some predictive model around? Right? Are we creating new data through our product, and on, right? Are we going to put our result into a reporting tool, or are we going to create a tool itself that is generating the results and feeding back to the organization in some such a way? I'm going to talk more about the outputs later on here, but suffice it to say, as we get to the outputs, there is a loop that goes back and informs our inputs and also our outputs. Typically, when I'm involved in an advanced analytics project, right, it's delivering consistency, efficiency, or some opportunity to the organization. It typically does it in one of these four areas. There's other frameworks that you could use to describe this. But the one I'll draw your attention to most critically here is decision support. Typically, when your models are producing some kind of estimate that is close in proximity to some decision making, right? Whether it be very micro level decisions, minute by minute, or whether they be macro strategic decisions. Right? These are the areas where people can wrap their head most cleanly around what is it that your model is trying to do. Other areas where analytics can be powerful is in anomaly detection, creation of data. This is one that people go, what do you mean you can get data? Well, we create estimates of various metrics all the time. We create probabilities, we create customer segments, we create claiming segments, market segments, so on and so forth. All of that is new data that can then be funneled into other projects throughout the organization. Knowing those areas where you're creating value, that is in those four buckets, and understanding the industry with which you work, right? So I'm showing insurance here because that's where I happen to be, but your insurance, other industries, understanding the core functions within that industry matters, right? So what do I mean by that? You may have an analytics shop that has expertise across all of these functions, or you may have a business sponsor and you're focused in one area. Regardless of what your model is, if you understand how these functions interrelate with each other, you can build stronger and better credibility within each one and across them. So for example, some functions are revenue generating or top line functions for the organization. Other areas are bottom line or expense managed, expense minded. Not only does that help you understand, well, what problems can I help them solve? It also helps you understand when there are natural tensions within the organization. So for example, does a marketing function or this distribution function create angst for underwriting or for claims, right? And is there information from claims that could feed back to actuarial or back to the distribution channel or and on and on. So just having that fundamental understanding and understanding where you need to build key relationships and key partnerships will go a long way within any one of the given functions. And again, to me, this concept translates well beyond any one industry. Whichever industry you happen to be in, it's important to understand those key functions. So another poll question here. I use this because I'm often asked this simple question, right? Okay, you're going to build a model for me. How much will it impact my favorite KPI? Insert your metric here. Give you a second here. Let's see what this distribution looks like. Well, I'm going to respond myself and see if that. A few people have responded. You know, there's no right answer to this, but my stock answer for this problem is if you do not have a good change management strategy, if you do not implement the model in meaningful ways, if you do not put it in a place where decision-making can take place. In other words, if you take the model and you tuck it into a drawer, close the drawer, check your box and say, hey, we built the model, my answer to you is going to be zero, that my model would have zero impact on your organization. But your results may vary depending on a number of factors. Here's another kind of framework that I think about in each of these, thinking about each of these concepts on the left will result in different success stories on the right, which I'll talk about a couple of. Right? Begin with quality data. If you get involved in a project, and I don't mean perfect data here, there's likely no such thing as perfect data in an organizational setting, but understanding where the warts are in the data will take you far, right? Understanding that there's a point where the data will not be of sufficient quality to build the model, because building that model on data that isn't usable then leads you to the disappointment that, well, we can't use this model because it's not credible, it's not reliable, it's not valid, and so on and so forth. That being said, you know, doing the right analysis to say that the data is of sufficient quality to get a usable model out of this you can still find benefit for your organization. Right, of course, validate the model, right? Build a model that is predictive and valid. But also think ahead. If you're going to implement the model, what's the plan to recalibrate the model or basically monitor the model for its continued performance? If it's built well, by and large, the model should hold for a period of a few years, maybe months, depending on how much the data changes. But the world around you, around that model, can shift and change. And so you want to be aware and communicate well that there's a possibility that in 2 years' time, we may have to relook at this model, rebuild it, and re-implement the new version. As you begin the model development process, you should begin thinking about your change management strategy, right? There should be an intervention by design, right? How are you going to communicate this to the people who are impacted? What people are going to be impacted by this model? Is there fear about the use of the model? Is there excitement and energy about the use of the model? And is there clarity about the implications for using and not using the model? Right? How have you changed the culture by the use of the model, right? If you don't adhere to these things, then I would argue that you don't have an effective change management plan, and the model may very well get tucked into a drawer. Play the model at a point where decisions are being made. I've said this time and again, right? But having it near a place where, for example, routing of cases is taking place, ranking of priorities, situations, claims, policies, whatever your situation is, or where actions are being done, right? So which prospects do I follow up on? Well, the model can help you guide you in that way. So if you plug the model into those places where decisions are being done, you're more likely to get impact. And just be aware that your results may vary. And I give you that is a on the success stories on the right here, my team has built models very similarly for multiple companies. Same KPIs, same types of data coming out of the organization, relatively similar experiences going in. But in one example I'll give you is we had a client that I would call relatively engaged. They were interested in the model, but and we didn't really have a benchmark otherwise. So what was the improvement? So after 2 years' time, we go back to recalibrate the model, and we can see through the data that it had a 5% improvement in this specific KPI that we're talking about. That actually is quite remarkable for this organization. That means a lot of money, a lot of improvement for them, significant enhanced performance. But contrast that with, by the way, that company is now even more engaged after that, and they're getting more models around this, which is more like the second example. So I had a comparatively more engaged client who we built a similar model for, but we also, for another product, built another model for. And then we did a one-off analysis that helped them in a change management process that led to an intervention for them outside of just implementing the model. This client, now on a slightly longer time horizon than we talked about here, but not twice as long, and certainly not 3 times as long, had a 13% increase. So almost a 2.5-fold improvement, better improvement there. So the point being is results may vary, and it all depends on the engagement of your business partners and your ability to insist that they have a change management plan and leverage different points within the organization where that model can be and see some impact. Very quickly, I'm going to go through 2 broad examples where just thinking about your models from a technical standpoint and bringing that back to the business on practical decision making, practical things to be considered, may gain you points with your business partner. It also shows that you're looking out for their best interests, even on a technical level. I'm kind of bringing this down a notch here. I don't want to get too hung up on terminology, but I'm going to, on one camp, talk about what we might call traditional modeling. So this would be things like regression-based analyses, GLM, for example. Yes, there are hundreds of other techniques that we might fall into traditional modeling. Likewise, there are hundreds of techniques over on what I would call the machine learning or modern statistical methodologies. But I'm going to simplify this here for today's conversation to talk about tree-based methods such as CART, random forest, GBMs, XGBoost, and that similar family of models. On the left-hand side, what you have are statistical models with distributional assumptions, which means that sometimes you don't meet those assumptions. The model may not hold. There's some challenges around what you need to do to solve those. But also, there's a lot of heavy lifting in how you create the features that go into those models, right? So there's a lot of research that goes into each and every feature to say, this is why this particular variable is included or not included, why interactions are included or not included, and on and on. A number of new tools are coming onto the scene that help you shortcut a lot of that manual lifting, right? Do the legwork for us. And that's the cautionary tale that I'm going to leave here is there are 3 things that I want to put in your mind that tree-based methods or other machine learning techniques will help you. The message I want you to leave with is know your technique, right? Know how do they impact in these 3 areas, right? So missing data, categorical predictors, and nonlinear interactions. So first off, in traditional modeling, you can't run a GLM with missing values in. So you have to have workarounds. You either impute the values in some way, or maybe you bend a variable, right? So you create categories, and you have one category that is that is the missingness category. Regardless of how you build the model, you've got to think about your implementation. So when you're going to score new data that comes in, even if you didn't have missing data when you were building, is it possible that you encounter missing data going forward? So what are you going to do in those instances, and how prevalent are the likelihood of missing data, and what's your workaround? Well, with modern machine learning techniques, not all of them, but some of them have capabilities inbuilt to deal with the missing data. The challenge that I put before you, though, is when they do deal with missing data, how do you know what's happening? Do you understand how it's handling that missing data? And is your business partner comfortable with the score that's output, if it's based on 1, 2, 10, all of the variables being missing? So this is just an opportunity for dialogue about how your model will impact their business, and how you gain credibility in this space. Categorical predictors are pretty easy to talk about in these terms. If I have gender, right, male and female doesn't really go into your model, but you can code them 0 and 1, 1 or 0, whatever. You can put some kind of numerical coding to it. And that's all fine and good. It's fairly easy to interpret. But when the categories become too problematic, for example, 50 states, your traditional modeling starts to get challenging. Well, that's fine, but what if you have 1,000 industries? Well, it gets even harder. Or what about 10,000 diagnosis codes, right, from medicine? So the point is that traditional methodologies tend to get overburdened when we have very traditional problems, as in categorical predictors. The other thing that I will mention is nonlinearities and interactions, and those typically are explicit, require explicit specifications. So going in, I know that the relationship between this variable and this variable depends on yet another variable, and that's what we mean by an interaction. So typically we can think these up, but we don't always know what is hiding in the data, and so some of these modern machine learning techniques will help us find these nonlinearities and interactions. These techniques will also help us with the high density categorical predictors, and you combine those two and you really got some complex things, right? So what if you've got 50 states interacting with some other variable in your model, and it becomes intractable in the traditional sense. The challenge is you don't always know how it may be handling these, because one algorithm to the next may be treating these differently. But also, if you don't find an interaction through your tree-based method, for example, that doesn't necessarily mean there isn't an interaction there. It's very easy, if I had time, it's very easy for me to demonstrate that there's a known interaction in the data that these methods don't necessarily pick up. Sometimes it's because there's another variable that's masking that interaction. But suffice it to say is know what's happening in the data. I'm not going to go into all the words here in the interest of time, but basically, if you're using these machine learning techniques, understand where the gotchas are, right? There's several considerations that you need to think about with respect to each of these: missing data, categorical predictors, and nonlinearities and interactions. And there's also several things, some of which I talked about on the previous slide, but you need to be very careful in how you interpret. For example, if you're missing all of the variables in the model, is your business partner comfortable with you producing a score and then making a decision based off of there was no information there? Maybe they want to route that particular case differently through their workflow. You may impose business constraints. For example, if one key variable is missing, don't score. Or if 3 or more variables are missing, don't score, or something along those lines. I think that's all I'm going to say on the machine learning gotchas. I've got one more poll question here. I'm going to give us a second to think about, is it okay if models discriminate? I'm going to click yes. I'm going to click my submit, and I'm going to go see what others thought. It turns out that the interpretation of that question really depends on what do we mean by discriminate, and is discriminate the right word for this scenario. Right? All models should discriminate if, for example, risk, right? We should be able to discriminate high risk from low risk. That's the whole point of building the model, or high probability of some behavior, or low probability of that behavior, or high probability of success, low probability of success, right? They're all discriminating. The question is your model defensible here, right? On the left-hand side, I have some vocabulary terms that all are more of a technical nature: validity, differential validity, utility bias. These are things that we typically use to describe models, and how that might impact the differential use of the model. On the right-hand side, we have concepts like fairness, unfair discrimination, disparate treatment, and adverse impact. These are typically socio-political concerns. So, for example, if a model is fair in one jurisdiction, it may or may not be fair in another jurisdiction, right? It must have context behind it. The idea of validity is simply this measuring what we said that it's supposed to measure, right? Is the model predicting what we said it was supposed to predict? Whether the model is unfair or not, a good quote comes to us from Bob Guyan from the 60s is different. Unfair discrimination exists when persons with equal probabilities of success have unequal probabilities of being selected, right? So the idea here is knowing which of these, concepts that we are interested in at any given time. And they almost always relate to a challenge that is data that we may not have thought of or may not have, and that is what happens when we have a protected class in the data, right? So just to give you a quick illustration, right? If we build a model, let's say it's a logistic model, we have our data, we have a familiar S-curve, right? This is the prediction. This is how discriminating the model is in terms of risk. But we can put that into a more simplistic framework. In this case, what I'm wanting you to see is the decision, whether we're correct or incorrect in our decisioning, is illustrated by the strength of the model. That is this ellipsis here around your data, right? So A's and B's are correct decisions, C's and D's are incorrect. When we introduce the concept of subgroups into our data, we can have a number of scenarios, right? One of those scenarios is what happens if the data or if the model itself is valid. So as we go across the horizontal axis, we may have our model scores. They could be one explanatory variable, or it could be the whole model prediction. And then on the vertical, we have our target. So for simplicity's sake, let's assume these are continuous variables, right? The ellipsis here represents the overall model, ignoring subgroups. And in this case, you can see the model is performing well, except if I created a threshold here where we're selecting something based off of above this score here, it's not hard to see that we're going to disproportionately select one group relative to the other. And so that will become one of those fairness concerns that we need to address, or not, right? But it shouldn't be ignorable for the most part, because it will have an impact to your overall result or book of business or whatever it is that you're concerned with. On the bottom hand here, I have another scenario where it looks like the model is reasonably predictive. The overall ellipse is a slight relationship between your horizontal and your vertical axis. We're we break it down by subgroup, though, what we find out is the model within each subgroup actually isn't working at all. There's no relationship between your model scores and your criterion or your target. So what's happening here? It's simply the subgroup differences at all that the model is picking up on. And sometimes these are, insidiously hiding inside your data. And so you may think that, wow, we have a really good model here, and all you're doing is actually creating an unfair, discriminating environment, right, where the model isn't predictive at all. And I'm reasonably out of time, but just to give you two more scenarios here. You could have a situation where your scores are different for the predictor, or your scores are different for your criterion, but within your model is working just fine for each subgroup. It just happens to be that they're working differently, right? So you have this differential prediction scenario. So as a result of that, what you may have concluded, if you didn't look at your subgroups, you may conclude that my model overall is not very strong, because if you see the ellipsis here, it's a pretty weak model. But within each sub, the model is relatively strong. So this is one of those scenarios where by ignoring this situation, you actually hurt yourself by not creating a stronger model. The last slide here is, when I build a model, I'm absolutely focused on the business problem that we start with. But as the model is in production, I do start looking around across, are there other functions that may benefit from the data that's generated from this model? So for example, maybe I build a model that's focused on enhanced claim management. So how do I take each case that comes to a claim manager's desk and help them prioritize strategies around what to do with this case? So for example, in long-term disability, we might triage cases in ways of saying, these cases you need to focus on some kind of expense management strategy. This group, let's spend time on returning to health. Let's see if we can get them into clinics or rehabilitation or whatnot, because those are cases that are most prone to improvement if encouraged. And then there may be some that I just don't need to spend any energy on, that they may be low touch. Using that scenario, I may then be able to look at the team as a whole and better understand the team management, the team dynamics. Where are the skills? How do I normalize for team individual differences in the team makeup? And how can I use that to determine if there's some individuals that need performance management, or if some need some additional training, or some other decisions to be made? And then you keep moving up the ladder here. What can we use that information for an organizational development initiative, right? Are we well skilled across the place? Do we need to do any kind of restructuring? Are we well suited for all of the efficiencies that we can? And where can we improve morale? And on, right? The same data could be used potentially for improved pricing or reserving, or maybe even for better underwriting. At some point in time. The point being is that you can open yourself up if you understand the industry you're in and all of the functions across it, and know where your model could have impact and how that impact may be beneficial across the organization as well. And now I think I'm absolutely out of presentation time, and I will turn it over to
Maisa. So I do have some questions for you, Tom. Thank you for such an insightful presentation. So question number one, how do you ensure your business partner or client is engaged?
Good question. There are times where a client will ask, hey, I just want you to do this analytics project for me. And when I go to ask back for resources, okay, well, let's say this is an underwriting shop, and I see, well, I may need some expertise from your team. One of the signals to me that they're not going to be terrifically engaged is when they say, oh, no, I just need you to do all of the analytics, and I don't need you to bother my team. That's a signal for me that we may need to go the other direction. On the other hand, when you explain how the model can impact and you talk to the client about your business partner about those things that I talked about, the bookends, right? Do we fully understand and appreciate your business problem? Do we know what is the impact of if we build this model, how is it going to impact your people? They start to realize that you really do care about their world, and they can tell that you're listening to them, and that generally merits more and more engagement, right? So then they begin to give you more resources to make sure that you are, on the right path, that you're building a model that's going to be as impactful to them as possible.
Awesome. Thank you. Second question that we have is, what are some typical things you consider for developing change management strategy?
Yeah, also a good question. And I think this is a critical part, right? To me, culture and change management often trumps the technical merits of your model, right? So I've seen models that were okay get implemented well and have high degree of impact to the business, and I've seen very good technical, well-validated models get put in a drawer because they didn't go through this. So these are the things that I think of. First off is what are decision points that are going to be taken into account? Like, where's this going to be plugged into the organization? Who are the people that are going to be impacted, and how do they feel about this? What have you communicated to those? What's your plan to communicate? What are the systems that you're going to plug this in? If you give them the model in an Excel spreadsheet or the back of a bar napkin, you may not get as much results as if you were to integrate the model into core tools that they ordinarily use. In other words, can you make it easy for the people who are going to be leveraging the model? And then figure out ways to measure a plan to measure the impact of the model. That one is the hardest that I've found to do. It's just because it depends so much on what's the point of the model and what are you trying to improve. But you generally can come up with something that is there. The model is being used. The model is effective in the way that it was designed. I guess this is another piece of advice, is that oftentimes people will jump to the wrong metric. So they're trying to evaluate the model off of the wrong measures. And then that just serves to disappoint people. It's like, what impact this measure? It's like, well, it wasn't designed for that. It's designed for this other thing.
Makes sense. We just got a new question from the audience. So I'm in the claims division, and whenever we talk about models for claim assignment or reserve review, there are immediate rejections, as this is clear-cut and well-managed, so no model is done. So how do you suggest there is room for improvement, or at least see if there is room? Business doesn't want change.
You got to identify. I heard a lot in that question, so let me see if I can try to break down as much of it as I can. The first point that I'll address is that I'm hearing resistance, and resistance comes in many forms. Like, I just don't want to change, so don't move my cheese, those sorts of things. So you have to understand what's the source of that resistance, and then you have to have a plan to address the source of resistance. So there is an aspect of this, is the wrong time is not going to benefit anyone. So I've seen where people are clearly pushing a rock up a hill because a business unit isn't ready for such change. Now, what does that mean? Maybe it's a key leader, an influential person, or maybe it's just the attitudes permeating the organization need to be addressed. So change readiness, that was sort of the first thing. The second is how do you go about change readiness? Well, it could be showing that the old world is a problem and the new world could be so much beneficial. It could be that you see that your competitors are doing something that you're not yet ready to do. And if you don't do that, you're going to lose your competitive advantage. That's one strategy. Another area to consider, and this isn't the first time I've heard this from claim folks, right? And well, we need to address every claim on its own merits and this, that, and the other. That's true, and the claim manager can handle every claim on its own merits, but that doesn't mean that in a given workday, you don't have some tool to tell you, of all of the things that you're looking at, how do I distill all that information into something so I can prioritize, right? So if I have to take 10 bits of information and juggle those 100 times, I'm going to be far less efficient than if I had a model that took that 10 bits of information and truncated it into a single thing for me to say, okay, work on this claim first and this one second and this one third. That doesn't mean that you kick the claim to the curb. It just means, how do I prioritize my work? And the final thing I would add to that is think about how you want to implement the model. So sometimes we get hung up on the implementation as the model is going to make all the decisions for me and the machine takes over and whatever. And oftentimes, by the time you get to implementation, that's actually not what's happening, is that the model is just there to augment the person, to make that person better at what they're doing, make them more efficient, more effective, help them find opportunities, and so forth.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tom. This was amazing. Thank you again to our audience. And I know if you wish to continue the conversation, I'm sure Tom would be happy to connect on LinkedIn. So I'd like to thank our first two speakers again, Chris and Tom, and to all of you for attending today, for submitting some fantastic questions. And with that, we draw day one to a close. We have another day ahead of us with 2 more sessions to enjoy. Tomorrow, we welcome Prashant Natarajan, Director of Data Science and Analytics at Unum Insurance Group, to share his work on leveraging analytics for AI for a superior omni-channel customer experience. Then, we have a stimulating panel discussion featuring Hartford Steam Boiler, Quincy Mutual Group, Haven Life, and Indeliant, all sharing their experience on engaging with different insurance business partners and adapting to change in today's fast-moving environment. I'm certain we're in for another insightful day, and we hope to see you all there. Until tomorrow, thank you for joining us and have a fantastic afternoon.